The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Florence as Lorenzo walked through the Piazza della Signoria, his mind heavy with the weight of recent events. Just 3 months prior, he had been the most trusted advisor to the Duke, a position he had earned through years of faithful service and what he believed to be unwavering loyalty to the principles of justice and honor. Now, he found himself stripped of title, wealth, and influence, branded a traitor by the very man he had served so devotedly. As he paused before the statue of David, Lorenzo's thoughts drifted to the words of Niccolò Machiavelli, whose treatise on power and governance had been whispered about in the corridors of power for decades. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, Machiavelli had written, for everyone can see and few can feel. Lorenzo had dismissed such cynicism in his youth, believing that good intentions and noble actions would inevitably triumph over duplicity and manipulation. How wrong he had been. The story of Lorenzo's downfall began not with malice or corruption on his part, but with a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. Lorenzo had operated under the assumption that others shared his commitment to truth and justice, that loyalty was reciprocal, and that merit would always be rewarded. These beliefs, while admirable in their idealism, had blinded him to the realities of political maneuvering and human ambition that governed the court. The first crack in Lorenzo's worldview appeared when he discovered financial irregularities in the duchy's accounts. Rather than approaching the matter with the calculated discretion that Machiavelli would have counseled, Lorenzo immediately reported his findings to the Duke, confident that his ruler would appreciate his vigilance and dedication to preventing corruption. What Lorenzo failed to consider was that these irregularities might implicate individuals with significant influence over the Duke, or that his discovery might be perceived as a threat rather than a service. Machiavelli understood that those in power often prefer comfortable lies to inconvenient truths. In The Prince, he observed that men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions. Lorenzo, in his naivety, had assumed that the Duke shared his commitment to rooting out corruption, regardless of the political cost. He failed to recognize that the Duke's primary concern was maintaining stability and his own position, not pursuing abstract ideals of justice. The Duke's response to Lorenzo's report was carefully calculated. Rather than immediately acting on the information, he praised Lorenzo's diligence while secretly beginning to distance himself from his advisor. This distancing was so subtle that Lorenzo, focused as he was on the righteousness of his cause, failed to notice the gradual cooling of their relationship. Invitations to private meetings became less frequent, his counsel was sought less often, and his recommendations were increasingly met with polite deferrals rather than immediate action. Meanwhile, those implicated in the financial irregularities had not remained idle. Understanding the threat that Lorenzo's discovery posed to their positions, they began a careful campaign to undermine his credibility and influence. They did not attack Lorenzo directly, which would have been too obvious and potentially counterproductive. Instead, they employed the subtle arts of character assassination that Machiavelli knew were far more effective than open confrontation. The campaign began with seemingly innocent questions about Lorenzo's judgment. In casual conversations with the Duke and other courtiers, Lorenzo's enemies would express concern about his tendency toward extremism and his inability to see the broader political picture. They would praise his integrity while questioning his wisdom, his loyalty while doubting his competence. These attacks were all the more effective because they contained elements of truth. Lorenzo was indeed uncompromising in his principles and often failed to consider the political ramifications of his actions. Machiavelli understood that the most effective way to destroy an enemy was not through direct assault but through the patient undermining of their reputation and relationships. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, he wrote, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. Lorenzo's enemies understood this principle instinctively, even if they had never read Machiavelli's words. They worked to make the Duke fear Lorenzo's moral rigidity more than he valued his competence. The second phase of Lorenzo's downfall came when he attempted to present his findings formally to the ducal council. Believing that a public forum would ensure that justice prevailed, Lorenzo prepared a detailed presentation outlining the financial irregularities and recommending specific actions to address them. What he failed to anticipate was that his enemies had spent months preparing for this moment, building alliances and preparing counterarguments that would shift the focus from the substance of his claims to questions about his motivations and methods. When Lorenzo presented his evidence to the council, he was met not with the reasoned discussion he had expected but with a carefully orchestrated response designed to discredit both his findings and his character. Council members who had been influenced by his enemies questioned not only the accuracy of his data but also his right to investigate such matters independently. They suggested that his actions represented an overreach of his authority and implied that his real motivation was not justice but personal ambition. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its appeal to the fears and insecurities of those in power. Rather than defending the corruption that Lorenzo had uncovered, his enemies positioned him as the greater threat, a zealot whose rigid morality and independent investigations threatened the stability and unity of the duchy. They painted him as someone who valued abstract principles over practical governance, who would sacrifice the good of the realm to satisfy his own sense of righteousness. Machiavelli would have recognized this tactic immediately. In his observations of political behavior, he noted that those in power are often more concerned with maintaining their positions than with addressing problems that might threaten their authority. The corruption Lorenzo had discovered was certainly a problem, but his investigation and the attention it brought to the issue represented a potentially greater threat to those who benefited from the existing system. Lorenzo's response to these attacks revealed the full extent of his naivety about human nature. Rather than adapting his strategy to address the political realities he faced, he doubled down on his moral arguments, believing that the truth would ultimately prevail. He prepared even more detailed documentation of the financial irregularities and attempted to present additional evidence to support his claims. This approach, while admirable in its integrity, played directly into his enemies' hands by confirming their characterization of him as an inflexible extremist. The final phase of Lorenzo's destruction came when his enemies succeeded in connecting his investigation to broader questions about his loyalty to the Duke. They suggested that his persistent pursuit of the corruption case, despite the Duke's obvious reluctance to act decisively, represented a fundamental challenge to ducal authority. They implied that Lorenzo believed himself to be above the Duke, that his moral certainty had blinded him to the proper hierarchies of power and authority. This accusation was particularly devastating because it contained enough truth to be credible. Lorenzo had indeed continued his investigation even after it became clear that the Duke preferred a more cautious approach. His commitment to justice had led him to prioritize his principles over his relationship with his ruler, a choice that Machiavelli would have recognized as politically suicidal. The Duke, faced with a choice between supporting Lorenzo's investigation and maintaining the stability of his court, chose the path that Machiavelli would have predicted. He began to view Lorenzo not as a valuable advisor but as a source of disruption and potential rebellion. The Duke's decision to remove Lorenzo from his position was not driven by any belief in his guilt or any personal animosity, but by a calculated assessment of political necessity. What made Lorenzo's situation particularly tragic was that his enemies' characterization of him as a threat was largely accurate, even though their motivations were self-serving. Lorenzo's unwavering commitment to justice did represent a challenge to the existing order, and his moral certainty did make him inflexible in his approach to political problems. His naivety lay not in his principles but in his failure to understand that principles alone are insufficient in the realm of politics. Machiavelli understood that effective governance requires a careful balance between moral ideals and practical considerations. A prince must not mind incurring the charge of cruelty for the purpose of keeping his subjects united and faithful, he wrote, recognizing that sometimes the pursuit of absolute justice can undermine the stability necessary for any justice to exist at all. Lorenzo's failure to appreciate this balance made him vulnerable to those who understood it all too well. The weeks following Lorenzo's dismissal provided him with ample opportunity to reflect on the lessons that Machiavelli had tried to teach centuries earlier. Walking through the streets of Florence, stripped of his former status and influence, Lorenzo began to see the city and its inhabitants with new eyes. He observed the countless small compromises and accommodations that made daily life possible, the way merchants balanced honesty with profit, the way artisans navigated between artistic integrity and patron demands. Everywhere he looked, Lorenzo saw evidence of what Machiavelli had called the effectual truth, the reality of how things actually work rather than how they should work in an ideal world. The baker who watered his milk to increase profits while maintaining a reputation for honesty, the priest who bent theological principles to accommodate wealthy donors, the judge who considered political implications alongside legal precedents, all were engaged in the kind of practical navigation between ideals and reality that Lorenzo had rejected in his own career. This observation led Lorenzo to a deeper understanding of what Machiavelli had meant when he wrote about the relationship between virtue and fortune. Traditional virtue, the kind that Lorenzo had practiced throughout his career, was indeed admirable and necessary for a well-ordered society. However, Machiavelli had argued that this traditional virtue needed to be combined with what he called virtù, the practical wisdom and adaptability necessary to navigate the complexities of political life. Lorenzo's commitment to traditional virtue had been absolute and inflexible. He had believed that doing the right thing would inevitably lead to good outcomes, and that those who shared his commitment to justice would recognize and reward his efforts. This belief had blinded him to the ways in which his enemies could use his own virtues against him, turning his integrity into evidence of inflexibility and his moral certainty into proof of dangerous extremism. The more Lorenzo reflected on his experiences, the more he began to understand what Machiavelli had observed about the nature of political conflict. Success in politics, Machiavelli argued, required not only good intentions but also an understanding of how others would respond to those intentions. The naive politician assumes that others share his motivations and will respond rationally to reasonable arguments. The sophisticated politician understands that others are driven by self-interest, fear, and ambition, and crafts his approach accordingly. Lorenzo's investigation of the financial irregularities had been driven by a genuine desire to serve the public good, but he had failed to consider how his investigation would be perceived by those with interests in maintaining the status quo. His presentation to the ducal council had been meticulously prepared and factually accurate, but he had not anticipated the political maneuvering that would frame the debate in terms unfavorable to his position. Most fundamentally, Lorenzo had failed to understand what Machiavelli called the lion and the fox principle. Effective leadership, Machiavelli argued, required the ability to be both a lion and a fox, to have the strength and courage to confront challenges directly when necessary, but also the cunning and adaptability to navigate around obstacles when direct confrontation would be counterproductive. Lorenzo had mastered the lion's approach, confronting corruption with courage and determination, but he had never developed the fox's skills of strategic thinking and tactical flexibility. This realization led Lorenzo to reconsider many of his previous judgments about the people and events he had encountered throughout his career. Colleagues whom he had dismissed as unprincipled or weak began to appear in a different light as he recognized the complex challenges they faced and the skill with which they had navigated those challenges. Decisions that had seemed obviously wrong to him revealed themselves to be carefully calculated responses to difficult circumstances. The Duke himself, whom Lorenzo had begun to view as weak or corrupt for his failure to act decisively on the financial irregularities, appeared more sympathetic when viewed through a Machiavellian lens. The Duke was trying to balance multiple competing interests and pressures, maintaining stability while addressing problems, preserving relationships while pursuing reforms. His cautious approach to Lorenzo's investigation was not necessarily evidence of moral compromise but possibly of political wisdom. This new perspective did not require Lorenzo to abandon his commitment to justice or to embrace the cynicism that he had always rejected. Rather, it allowed him to see that the pursuit of justice in a complex political environment required a more sophisticated understanding of human nature and political dynamics than he had previously possessed. The goal remained the same, but the methods needed to be more carefully calibrated to the realities of how people actually behave. Machiavelli's insights about human nature were not fundamentally pessimistic, despite their reputation for cynicism. Rather, they were realistic assessments of the motivations and behaviors that drive political action. People are indeed capable of nobility and self-sacrifice, but they are also driven by self-interest and fear. Effective political action requires an understanding of both aspects of human nature and the ability to craft approaches that account for both. Lorenzo's enemies had succeeded not because they were inherently more evil or corrupt than he was, but because they had a more sophisticated understanding of how political systems actually work. They had recognized that reputation and perception were often more important than facts, that relationships and alliances were crucial for political success, and that direct confrontation was usually less effective than indirect influence. These insights did not excuse their corruption or validate their methods, but they did explain their effectiveness. Lorenzo's moral superiority had not been sufficient to overcome their tactical advantages, and his commitment to principle had actually made him more vulnerable to their attacks. This was the essence of what Machiavelli had tried to teach, that good intentions without political wisdom often lead to defeat, and that defeat for the virtuous can mean victory for the corrupt. As the months passed and Lorenzo adapted to his new circumstances, he began to develop a more nuanced understanding of how he might have approached his situation differently. Rather than immediately reporting his discovery of financial irregularities to the Duke, he might have first built alliances with other council members who shared his concerns about corruption. Instead of presenting his findings as an immediate crisis requiring decisive action, he might have framed them as part of a broader effort to improve the duchy's financial management. Most importantly, Lorenzo realized that he might have been more effective if he had better understood the motivations and concerns of those who would be affected by his investigation. Rather than assuming that everyone shared his commitment to abstract justice, he might have crafted arguments that addressed their specific interests and fears. He might have offered solutions that addressed the corruption while providing face-saving alternatives for those who had benefited from the existing system. This approach would not have required Lorenzo to compromise his fundamental principles, but it would have required him to be more strategic about how he pursued those principles. It would have demanded the kind of patient, long-term thinking that Machiavelli associated with successful political action, rather than the immediate moral satisfaction that came from direct confrontation with wrongdoing. The irony of Lorenzo's situation was that his naivety about human nature had made him less effective at serving the very causes he cared most about. His inflexible commitment to principle had prevented him from achieving practical reforms that might have reduced corruption and improved governance. His moral purity had cost him the influence necessary to make a meaningful difference in the lives of those he had sought to serve. This realization brought Lorenzo to a deeper appreciation of what Machiavelli had meant when he wrote about the relationship between ethics and effectiveness in political life. The choice was not between being moral and being immoral, but between different approaches to pursuing moral goals in an imperfect world. The naive approach assumed that good intentions were sufficient and that others would recognize and reward virtue. The sophisticated approach recognized that virtue needed to be combined with wisdom, and that effectiveness required an understanding of human nature in all its complexity. Lorenzo's reflection on his experiences also led him to reconsider the meaning of loyalty and betrayal in political relationships. He had initially viewed his dismissal as a betrayal by the Duke, whom he had served faithfully for so many years. However, as he gained a more sophisticated understanding of political dynamics, he began to see that the Duke's decision might have been driven more by practical necessity than by personal animosity. The Duke had been faced with a choice between supporting Lorenzo's investigation and maintaining the stability of his government. From the Duke's perspective, Lorenzo's inflexible pursuit of the corruption case had become a source of division and conflict that threatened to undermine his authority and effectiveness. The Duke's decision to remove Lorenzo might have been seen not as a betrayal of their personal relationship but as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the duchy. This perspective did not make Lorenzo's dismissal any less painful, but it did provide him with a framework for understanding why it had occurred. Rather than attributing his downfall to malice or bad luck, he could see it as the result of predictable political dynamics that he had failed to navigate effectively. This understanding was both humbling and empowering, humbling because it forced him to acknowledge his own mistakes, but empowering because it suggested that different choices might have led to different outcomes. The third and final phase of Lorenzo's education in political realism came as he began to observe how his former enemies consolidated their victory and managed the aftermath of his removal. Rather than simply celebrating their success, they moved quickly to address some of the concerns he had raised about financial irregularities. They implemented modest reforms that appeared to address the most obvious problems while preserving the essential structures that had allowed corruption to flourish. This response revealed the sophistication of their political thinking in ways that Lorenzo had not previously appreciated. They understood that simply defeating Lorenzo was not sufficient if the underlying issues he had raised continued to cause problems. By implementing carefully calibrated reforms, they were able to demonstrate their commitment to good governance while avoiding the kind of comprehensive investigation that Lorenzo had demanded. The reforms they implemented were indeed modest compared to what Lorenzo had proposed, but they were also politically sustainable in ways that his approach might not have been. Rather than seeking to root out all corruption immediately, they focused on the most visible and problematic cases. Rather than demanding punishment for all those involved in financial irregularities, they offered amnesty in exchange for cooperation with new oversight procedures. Machiavelli would have recognized this approach as an example of what he called the art of the possible, pursuing achievable improvements rather than demanding perfect solutions. Lorenzo's enemies had succeeded not only in defeating him but also in appropriating some of his agenda in ways that served their own interests. This was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their political strategy. Watching this process unfold, Lorenzo began to understand one of the most important lessons that Machiavelli had tried to teach about political change. Effective reform often requires working within existing systems and relationships rather than challenging them directly. The reformer who demands immediate and comprehensive change often finds himself isolated and defeated, while the reformer who works patiently to build coalitions and find acceptable compromises can achieve meaningful progress over time. This insight did not require Lorenzo to abandon his commitment to justice or to accept the modest reforms implemented by his former enemies as sufficient. However, it did suggest that he might have been more effective if he had approached the problem differently from the beginning. Rather than presenting his investigation as a crisis requiring immediate action, he might have framed it as the beginning of a long-term process of improvement. Rather than demanding punishment for those involved in financial irregularities, he might have focused on preventing future problems through improved oversight and accountability measures. Rather than challenging the existing power structure directly, he might have worked to build alliances that could support more substantial reforms over time. The tragedy of Lorenzo's situation was not that he had been wrong about the existence of corruption or naive about the need for reform. His investigation had been accurate, and his concerns about financial irregularities had been well-founded. The tragedy was that his approach to addressing these problems had been so politically unsophisticated that it had enabled his enemies to defeat him while appropriating sanitized versions of his agenda. As Lorenzo walked through the streets of Florence on that spring morning, now almost a year after his dismissal, he carried with him a transformed understanding of political life that would have been familiar to Machiavelli. He had learned that good intentions without political wisdom often lead to defeat, that moral purity without tactical flexibility can serve the interests of the corrupt, and that the pursuit of justice in an imperfect world requires not the abandonment of principle but the development of more sophisticated methods for advancing principled goals. The lessons Lorenzo had learned were not merely academic or philosophical but intensely practical. They spoke to fundamental questions about how individuals with moral commitments should navigate complex political and social environments. They addressed the tension between idealism and pragmatism that faces anyone who seeks to make positive change in the world. Most importantly, Lorenzo's experiences illustrated what Machiavelli had understood about the relationship between individual character and political success. It was not enough to be virtuous, one also needed to be wise. It was not sufficient to have good intentions, one also required an understanding of how others would respond to those intentions. The naive politician who failed to appreciate these realities would find himself outmaneuvered by those who understood them, regardless of the moral superiority of his position. This understanding did not require Lorenzo to become cynical or to abandon his commitment to justice. Rather, it demanded that he develop a more sophisticated appreciation of human nature and political dynamics. It required him to see that the world was more complex than he had previously recognized, and that effectiveness in pursuing moral goals required not less virtue but a different kind of virtue, one that combined traditional moral commitments with practical wisdom and strategic thinking. The afternoon sun was setting over Florence as Lorenzo made his way home, his mind still processing the lessons he had learned through such painful experience. He thought of Machiavelli's observation that fortune favors the bold, but also his warning that boldness without wisdom often leads to disaster. Lorenzo had certainly been bold in his pursuit of justice, but his boldness had been undermined by his naivety about the political environment in which he was operating. Looking back on his career, Lorenzo could see dozens of moments when a more sophisticated understanding of human nature might have led him to make different choices. Conversations with colleagues that he had approached with naive openness might have been handled with greater strategic awareness. Relationships that he had taken for granted might have been cultivated more carefully. Challenges that he had met with direct confrontation might have been addressed through more indirect and patient methods. These reflections were not exercises in regret but opportunities for learning. Lorenzo understood that his experiences, painful as they had been, had provided him with insights that might serve him well in whatever future endeavors awaited him. He had learned not to abandon his principles but to pursue them more effectively. He had discovered not that virtue was unimportant but that virtue alone was insufficient. The story of Lorenzo's rise and fall illustrates the central thesis that Machiavelli had tried to convey through his writings about politics and human nature. Success in political life requires not only good intentions but also an understanding of how those intentions will be received and responded to by others. The individual who assumes that others share his motivations and will respond rationally to reasonable arguments is likely to find himself outmaneuvered by those who understand the more complex and sometimes contradictory nature of human behavior. This does not mean that idealism is impossible or that cynicism is inevitable. Rather, it suggests that effective idealism requires a sophisticated understanding of the environment in which idealistic goals must be pursued. The reformer who seeks to change the world must first understand the world as it actually exists, with all its complexities and contradictions. Machiavelli's insights about human nature remain relevant not because they counsel despair or cynicism, but because they provide a foundation for more effective action in pursuit of positive change. The individual who understands that others are motivated by self-interest as well as principle can craft approaches that address both motivations. The leader who recognizes that perception is often as important as reality can work to shape perceptions in ways that support his goals. The politician who appreciates that relationships and alliances are crucial for success can invest the time and effort necessary to build and maintain those relationships. The reformer who understands that comprehensive change often requires patient, incremental progress can develop strategies that achieve meaningful improvements over time rather than demanding immediate perfection. Lorenzo's education in these realities had come at great personal cost, but it had also provided him with insights that might serve him well in whatever challenges lay ahead. He had learned to see human nature not as he wished it to be but as it actually was, with all its mixture of nobility and self-interest, courage and fear, wisdom and folly. This understanding would not make his future endeavors easier, but it would make them more likely to succeed. As the stars began to appear over Florence, Lorenzo reflected on the words that Machiavelli had written centuries earlier about the relationship between virtue and fortune in human affairs. Fortune, Machiavelli had argued, could be influenced by virtue, but only by a kind of virtue that combined moral commitment with practical wisdom. The naive individual who trusted entirely to fortune would find himself at the mercy of circumstances beyond his control. The wise individual who understood both human nature and political dynamics could shape circumstances to serve his purposes. Lorenzo's story was not one of good luck or bad luck, but of naivety about human nature and its consequences. His downfall had not been the result of malicious fate or unavoidable circumstances, but of predictable responses to his own political choices. His enemies had succeeded not because they were inherently more powerful or clever, but because they had understood certain realities about political life that he had failed to appreciate. This understanding was both sobering and hopeful. It was sobering because it forced Lorenzo to acknowledge his own responsibility for what had happened to him. However, it was also hopeful because it suggested that different choices might lead to different outcomes, that the lessons he had learned might help him navigate future challenges more effectively. The city of Florence slept peacefully that night, its citizens largely unaware of the political dramas that had played out in their midst over the past year. The financial irregularities that Lorenzo had discovered were being addressed through modest reforms that satisfied most observers without threatening the interests of those in power. The Duke continued to rule with the same mixture of caution and pragmatism that had characterized his reign for many years. Lorenzo himself had found modest employment as a teacher, sharing his knowledge of law and administration with young men who aspired to careers in government service. His experiences had given him insights that complemented his formal education, and his students benefited from both his theoretical knowledge and his practical understanding of how political systems actually functioned. In his teaching, Lorenzo found himself returning again and again to the themes that Machiavelli had explored in his writings about politics and human nature. He taught his students about the importance of understanding the motivations and interests of those with whom they would work. He emphasized the need to build relationships and alliances before attempting to implement reforms. He stressed the value of patience and strategic thinking in pursuing long-term goals. Most importantly, Lorenzo tried to convey to his students the lesson that he had learned through such painful experience, that effectiveness in serving the public good required not the abandonment of moral principles but the development of more sophisticated methods for advancing those principles. The naive idealist who failed to understand political realities would find himself defeated by those who understood them all too well. The wise idealist who combined moral commitment with practical wisdom could achieve meaningful progress toward just and effective governance. The legacy of Lorenzo's experiences, and of Machiavelli's insights about human nature, continued to influence political thinking and action long after both men had passed from the scene. Each generation of leaders faced the same fundamental challenge of pursuing worthy goals in a complex and often contradictory world. Those who learned from history's lessons about human nature and political dynamics were more likely to succeed in making positive change. Those who remained naive about these realities were likely to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. The story of Lorenzo's education in political realism serves as a reminder that the choice between idealism and cynicism is often a false one. The real choice is between naive idealism that fails to understand the world as it actually exists, and sophisticated idealism that combines moral commitment with practical wisdom. The former leads to defeat and frustration, the latter offers the possibility of meaningful progress toward a more just and effective society. It is not bad luck that defeats the naive politician or reformer, but naivety itself, naivety about human nature, about political dynamics, and about the complexities of pursuing moral goals in an imperfect world. Understanding this reality is the first step toward developing the kind of sophisticated virtue that can actually succeed in making positive change. It is a lesson that Machiavelli tried to teach 5 centuries ago, and one that remains as relevant today as it was in Renaissance Florence.